Soon, Mom's gonna pass the company on to me. The way she talks, Dad's will must be written to leave me the inheritance and the company. Otherwise, she wouldn't let me get away with so much. One day, when I happened to come home from work early, I heard the voices of Ken and Skylar, who were supposed to be at work, arguing. It was clear they hadn't noticed me. It seems they planned to deceive me and monopolize the inheritance left behind. I left without being noticed and went back to the office. Once back at the office, I took out the will left by my husband from the drawer. No matter how many times I checked, it said the same thing. Ken mistakenly thinks that he can get everything. He said such a thing now, but he doesn't yet know the ruin that awaits him. My name is Kelly Martin, 55 years old. I'm currently working as the CEO of a cosmetics company. Though I say that, I only took over the company about 6 months ago. The company was founded and managed by my husband. He fell seriously ill and passed away 6 months ago. I was an employee of the company. I married the manager, my husband. I continued working by his side as an employee ever since. However, I never imagined I would suddenly be entrusted with running the company. When he was close to passing, he asked me to continue the company. I couldn't ignore my beloved husband's wish. Though it was sudden, I decided to honor his request. The day after hearing my decision, he passed away, seemingly at peace. However, I wasn't allowed the time to immerse myself in memories or even to mourn. The fate of the company and its employees, entrusted to me by my husband, depend on me. Fortunately, the staff really helped out with the funeral arrangements. Even though I tried to act as usual, I was often absent-minded and anxious, so their offer was much appreciated. It must have been my husband's personality that brought together such warm-hearted people. After all, it was his character that drew me to him as well. Once the funeral was over, I began to reorganize the company based on the personnel changes my husband had previously decided on. His foresight was remarkable, making it easier for me to work than ever before. Though it was for my sake, the reorganization was also satisfactory to the other employees. Thanks to this, there were no complaints from anyone. Thus, the company was able to make a fresh start. It was about 6 months after my husband had passed. I received an unexpected visit. "It's been a while, Mom." The visitor was Ken, my only son, who suddenly showed up at our house on his day off. It had been 8 years since I last saw Ken's face. 8 years without seeing one's own son is unimaginable for a normal family. And there's a deep reason for that. It all started 8 years ago when my husband was still alive. At the time, Ken was a college student and he lived in a dorm. He didn't work part-time, because his studies were too hard, and my husband covered all his living expenses. Looking back, I realized this was somewhat abnormal and that we might have been too indulgent. Upon reflection, it's implausible for a college student to be so overwhelmed by studies that they can't even work part-time. Far from his studies being too hard, Ken wasn't even attending college at all. To put it plainly, without consulting us, Ken had dropped out of college on his own. He used the tuition and living expenses from us by himself. And by living expenses, I mean hardly any of it was used appropriately. It's a common among college students, but Ken had fallen deep into a life of gambling. One day, a demand for payment from a finance company addressed to Ken came, and that's when everything came to light. By the time we noticed, Ken's debts had ballooned to an amount far beyond what a college student could handle. My husband was furious when he found out, but decided to take on all of Ken's debts, fulfilling his responsibility as a parent. Despite this, Ken unapologetically claimed that it was all our fault. "I ended up like this because of you guys. It's not my fault at all." Hearing this, my husband finally kicked Ken out of the house. We stopped seeing him. Since then, Ken had disappeared from our lives. Naturally, he didn't show up for my husband's funeral, nor were we able to inform him about it. We didn't even know where Ken was living or his contact information. And then suddenly, here he was. It seems he had somehow heard about my husband's passing. Despite my bad feeling, I couldn't just turn away my own son, so I invited Ken into the house. "I'm gonna take over Dad's company," he said quickly as soon as he sat down in the room. I had a feeling this was coming, but hearing it from him directly made me feel even heavier. We didn't cut ties as family, right? So, I should have the right to inherit the company and the assets. Is the first thing he talks about after seeing his mother for the first time in 8 years really money and the company? At least, he should refer to his dad's death. In the end, Ken never once paid his respects to my husband's memory. The conversation continued to be one-sided, with Ken repeatedly asserting his rights. During this, I learned that Ken now had a wife and child. "I'm a father now, I'm different from before. I want to exercise my rights for my family," he just insisted. But I just didn't want to continue the conversation with Ken any longer that day. "I can't make a decision about anything right now. I have work to do later, so let's pick another day," I managed to say to get Ken out of the house, but my heart was filled with anxiety. Honestly, if I didn't pay him any attention next time, he would probably give up and never show up again. However, there was a reason I couldn't just ignore Ken. It was written in a letter left by my husband. Though he couldn't say it to me directly, it was something he wanted to convey desperately. "Please forgive Ken," the letter said. Despite having kicked him out, it seems my husband still had lingering concerns about his son. I had wondered why my husband never mentioned Ken until the end, but through the letter, he entrusted me with his son's future. Despite what was written in the letter, I couldn't abandon Ken at this point. I decided to wait for the next time Ken would visit. Just 2 days later, Ken came to see me. He was not alone this time but with his wife Skylar and his son, John. John would be my grandson, but strangely, I didn't feel much emotion seeing him. He's at the adorable age of 3, but he is like a stranger to me. Skylar, 24 years old and 4 years younger than Ken, had the look of the modern youth. For her, the realization that I am her husband's mother might be weak. She didn't seem nervous or trying to flatter in any way. "Aren't your grandson cute?" Ken bragged, but my feelings didn't change. After a brief talk, we quickly got to the point. "So, about me taking over the company." I briefly conveyed to Ken what was written in the letter I received from my husband. Soon after, a sleazy smile began to appear on both Ken and Skylar's faces. "But I can't decide right now, and it's not something I can decide on my own," I said. Their expressions quickly turned to irritation. "Are you saying you're going to ignore Dad's will? Then let us live in this house, so you don't betray us. You're alone now, you must be worried, right?" Ken declared unilaterally, and Skylar immediately agreed. That would be best. It seemed they had decided this between themselves beforehand. They wouldn't allow me to say no, and the conversation forcefully moved forward. When it's said that there's a will from my husband, I couldn't just say no. Before I knew it, the moving procedures were underway, and a week later, all 3 of them were going to descend upon my house. What exactly is their aim? Sadly, these were the feelings I harbored towards my own son. Naturally, everyone at the company had negative opinions about Ken. I had no intention of handing over the company itself, but bringing in a son who had been out of touch for 8 years was, to say the least, a questionable decision. Everyone understood my husband's wishes, but they thought it was too risky. I was left with a great deal of worry. Now, having the 3 of them move in has been troubling me. Saying they have work, they leave John in childcare at my expense, and Ken and Skylar don't return until late at night. Dad left a will because he cared about me, Ken would say, starting to rely on me for most of his living. Despite supposedly working from morning till night, the 2 of them don't pay for anything. Even as I felt questions and dissatisfaction with this situation, I couldn't say anything. Living together, I noticed that Skylar seemed to be juggling several jobs. The laundry included uniforms from what seemed like restaurants and factory work clothes. Despite being young, she appeared to be pushing herself too hard. "Aren't you working too much?" One day, unable to bear it any longer, I finally spoke up. Then, Skylar laughed softly and said in a quiet voice, "I have no choice." Although her words could be taken in many ways, somehow, my bad feelings towards her disappeared. It's true they were counting on what my husband left behind, but I could sense Skylar's sincere hard work. Compared to that, my feelings towards Ken never changed. When we lived together, was I this detached towards my son? No, that can't be right. Because we loved Ken, my husband and I always listened to his wishes. We were both working, so the house was often left empty. In a way, doing everything we could for him was our attempt at making amends. These actions were undoubtedly out of love. The one who changed wasn't us, but Ken. Despite our blood relation, Ken now feels like a complete stranger to me. Living under the same roof again made this all too clear. There's no sense of respect for his father. Amidst this life, one day, I managed to finish work early and returned home. I was looking forward to some rare downtime, as I had been left to care for John even on my days off. Then I realized that Ken and Skylar was at home. I could hear their voices inside. "Don't worry, soon Mom will hand over the company to me. The way she talks, Dad's will must have written for me to inherit everything, including the company. Otherwise, she wouldn't let me do whatever I want," Ken said, his tone slightly angry. "Even so, wouldn't it be good to try working seriously for once? Do you even realize how much debt you're accumulating? It's been gambling even after John was born, nothing has changed." They seemed to be arguing, completely unaware of my return. "That's why we moved out of that crappy apartment and imposed on Mom. If I say it'll work out, it will. You just need to keep quiet and follow me," Ken exclaimed, followed by the sound of something being slammed, probably a desk. Without letting them notice, I quietly closed the door and headed back to the office. Ken's intentions had become clear. He plans to take everything from me. While reading my husband's letters, I made up my mind. I'll leave them and move out of this house. From Ken's conversation, their life seems to be in shambles. Stuck in gambling just like his student days and drowning in debt. They lead a life completely reliant on Skylar's meager earnings without even attempting to work. Though he left from us, he probably thinks he can rely on their parents when things get tough, living like that up until now. When life became unsustainable, Ken received what he least expected as good news. It was clear that if I left, their life would immediately fall apart, leading them to be destitute. However, my decision remains unchanged. I'm absolutely not willing to mess up my life any further. Once I made up my mind, I talked to a few close employees about the situation and headed home. As expected, Ken had left the house pretending to go to work. I took this opportunity to have the employees help me move out all the furniture from the house. We decided to store these items at the office for the time being, essentially clearing out the house. This should make it immediately obvious to the two of them that I've left. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I got a call from Ken. "Mom! What the heck is going on? Why is all the furniture gone from the house?" Ken's fury was palpable the moment I answered the phone. I could hear Skylar's panicked voice and John's crying in the background. "Why would you do this? Dad told you, right? To leave something for me too." As expected, Ken started claiming that he was entitled to my husband's estate. What? There was nothing written about transferring the estate to Ken. My statement seemed to freeze Ken on the other end of the phone. "What are you talking about? After you sneakily left the house, now you want to hog all of Dad's inheritance for yourself." It was all there in the letters my husband left. All of the company and assets belonged to Kelly. But I can't blame Ken for thinking this way. It's true my husband asked me to forgive Ken. However, he clearly intended for everything tangible to be left to me. That meant all the money and the company were mine. Take care of Ken, he had said, but that was a separate issue. "Just come back quickly. Otherwise, I'm gonna sue you." Right now, no matter how much I explain, Ken won't listen. He's convinced that I've run off with the company and estate he was supposed to inherit. See? I told you, didn't I? Relying on your mother for everything isn't a real solution. Skylar's pained cry, guessing the gist of our conversation, could be heard over the phone. Yes. The reason I hesitated until the end to abandon these three was because of her. My husband's wish seemed one-sided at first, but the final decision was left up to me, as he wrote. He worried that after his death, I would bear the burden of being the mother who abandoned her son for life. Of course, he also had lingering concerns about Ken, but the true heart of his wish was his consideration for me. Reuniting with Ken honestly made my feelings waver. After all, I had accepted their selfishness and welcomed them back home. I kept repeating my husband's words in my head over and over, continuing to struggle. He wanted to relieve the snag in my heart by forgiving Ken. Ignoring his feeling was painful for me. However, more than that, I was convinced that continuing to accept Ken would ruin my life. If I were to truly embrace my husband's intentions, I should choose what's best for me. Though I decided, Skylar remained a concern for me. Surely, her life must have been ruined because she was swayed by Ken. Thinking about this made me hesitate in my decision. But I couldn't afford to waver here. Hardening my heart, I ignored Skylar's cries and Ken's raging voice and hung up the phone. The day after I left the house, Ken had the audacity to storm into the company. Knowing of my husband's death, I had anticipated he might figure out the company's whereabouts. But I never expected him to just barge in like this. Ken showed up with Skylar and John in tow. An appointment? I'm the heir to this company. Just call Mom out. After receiving a distress signal from the receptionist, I headed to the lobby. Ken apparently hadn't given up yet. As he recognized me, Ken charged at me with incredible force. You traitor! Have some shame! How could you abandon your son and grandson like that? And to top it off, hogging all of Dad's estate for yourself. I had shared information about the company's direction and Ken's existence with almost everyone in the company after my husband passed away. But nobody had thought he would confront us directly like this. Everyone could only watch this bizarre scene unfold, holding their breath. Sure, Dad might have intended to give all the money to Mom. But as Dad's son, I should have the right to inherit this company, shouldn't I? Normally, a child might have the right to make such a claim. But Ken had no right to inherit our company, my and my husband's company. Even if my husband had wished for Ken to be the next president, it wouldn't be that simple. It's common sense that the opinions of employees and executives who have supported the company so far should be respected. Without their agreement, it's naturally impossible to entrust the company to anyone. If such tyranny were allowed, people would soon leave the company. Ken must be aware of this logic and that he's making unreasonable demands. When he was kicked out of the house, he should have realized all of this. However, he felt he had no choice. Too drastic measures is only way to escape a life drowned in debt. If you say that you won't let me inherit the company, I will sue soon. Skylar, say something from you. Impatient with my silence, Ken turned to Skylar. Witnessing his father's bizarre behavior, John was in tears. As Skylar gently stroked John's head, she stepped forward. The one I want to talk to is you. Enough is enough. Her anguished cry echoed through the lobby, bringing a moment of silence all around. Ken seemed unable to comprehend Skylar's words. What? What are you talking about? You said you'd follow me for John's sake, didn't you? Ken said, mocking Skylar. From Ken's words, I was certain. Skylar felt unable to leave Ken despite wanting to. Probably because of a sense of responsibility as a mother. I, who had struggled with whether to abandon Ken, could painfully understand Skylar's feelings. Even if you were to take over the company, it's impossible with you. Ever since we met, you hardly worked and were always gambling. Tomorrow will be different, tomorrow will change. What was I who believed in that? Tears welled up in Skylar's eyes. Indeed, I was a fool. for falling in love with someone like you. John, looking into his mother's tearful face, voiced his concern. Mom, are you okay? Don't cry. To which, Skylar responded while stroking his head. John, I'm sorry. It's just going to be the two of us from now on. Skylar's voice, though feeble, contained a firm determination that even I could sense. Ken, from now on, I'm going to live for myself. And I will take responsibility for raising John. We're done. The employees, inadvertently caught up in this, were unable to make even a single sound, shocked by the unbelievable scene unfolding before them. Ken, you have no reason to stop Skylar. She's already realized it. You can't do anything on your own. In fact, your presence makes everyone unhappy. These aren't words one should have to say to their own son, I'm well aware. But I wish you could understand why I have to say such things. I don't need to please anyone, but to the employees watching this situation unfold, I make these excuses in my heart. There's nothing left for you here. Leave now. If you can't even do that, I'll call the police for you. Ken's face, filled with anger, changed to despair at the mention of police. Being threatened with the police by his own mother. For Ken, who's always been too soft, that reality was enough to shatter him. No, it was more than enough. What are you talking about? Skylar, say something. I'm not going to divorce you. Ken completely lost it and turned his anger towards Skylar. Stop! I don't want to call the police in front of this child. Fear appeared in John's eyes as he clung to Skylar. It was clear to anyone that his gaze wasn't meant for his father. Hearing Skylar's cry, Ken finally collapsed on the spot. Being rejected by the only person who had ever cared for him and catered to his needs up until now. For Ken, who could do nothing on his own, this reality was too much to bear. It signified the ruin of his life. Everyone, I'm truly sorry for bringing my personal issues here. Please return to your usual work. I said, and the employees, who had been immobilized, came back to life. As if pretending they hadn't seen what had just happened, they returned to their daily routines. At the center of the area everyone avoided was Ken, kneeling. Ken, in accordance with your father's will, I'll grant you a bit of kindness. I'll give you 10 minutes to leave this company. Make sure to move out all your stuff from the house by today. If you have any complaints, hire a lawyer with your own money and file a claim against me. I offered Ken this last bit of mercy and then turned to Skylar and John. Skylar, John, come with me. I said, leaving Ken to a few employees still in the lobby and led the two to the president's office. I brewed some coffee from the office coffee maker and offered it to Skylar. After inviting them to sit, I opened the conversation. You followed Ken to protect John, didn't you? To my words, Skylar showed a look of surprise. If you put it that way, my actions might seem justified. But honestly, there was also my own desire. I thought if money came in, we wouldn't have to live like this. Skylar looked down, her gaze fixed on the coffee on the table. It's natural to think that way. In the end, I abandoned my son for my own life. But you didn't abandon this child. You chose to lead a difficult life with him. That decision wasn't just for yourself. As I spoke, tears began to overflow in Skylar's eyes again. John looked up at his mother's face and gently stroked her back. Our meeting might not have been the best, but I don't resent you. No matter what decisions you and I make, John is your son and my grandson. So, I will watch over your lives. Love for my grandson, which I hadn't felt while living together, started to grow now. It was just because I saw him through Ken that I hadn't felt attached before, but now, I firmly recognized him as my dear grandson. As I shared my thoughts, Skylar cried more than ever before. Even young John seemed to understand that these tears were different from before. You're lucky, Mom. He said, smiling and continuing to rub her back. As for Ken, contrary to our worries, he left the house smoothly. It seems he finally understood that he was abandoned by us. Staying here would bring him no benefit. While there had been no word from him for a while, one day, the company received a call from the local police. "Are you a relative of Ken Martin?" Actually, what the officer relayed was that Ken had been found collapsed in a park. It seems he had been wandering around the city for days without eating or drinking much. He was being cared for in a local hospital due to malnutrition and mental confusion. He seems to be in a state of confusion, but we understand there have been various issues within the family. Since he is an adult, even if you are a relative, the future course of action will be up to you. It seems the hospital, sensing the complex situation, won't force me to take him in. Even as his parent, I'm not obligated to that extent. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I no longer have any involvement with him," I said, perhaps coldly, but decisively. After my words, there was a moment of silence, but soon a voice replied. "Understood." While physically and mentally worn out, Ken was safe, at least. It's enough. No joy, no sorrow. But this is my answer. Later, Skylar and Ken's divorce would be officially recognized. Skylar had become so worn down because she had been looking after Ken for so long. The damages caused by gambling and the regular psychological abuse were considered. Ken apologized to them. Now, Ken has literally become penniless and, despite his deteriorated mental and physical health, has been forced to engage in difficult and strenuous work. It's a just retribution for the years of suffering he inflicted on Skylar. What my husband truly wanted from me, I can no longer be sure. What would he think of the decision I made? After spending so long together, I believe he would forgive this outcome. Having watched a father who loved his wife so dearly, how could Ken have felt nothing? If he had loved Skylar, clumsy and poor though he might be, and lived each day with effort, surely this would not have been the end. Or maybe, the day we went our separate ways, it was already decided that things would turn out this way. Either way, Ken betrayed the kindness Skylar and I offered, drowning in his own desires. We weren't being selfish at all. We did what we could, and beyond that, we reclaimed our own lives. The company has regained its vibrancy, just like when my husband was around, growing daily with strategies that leverage the strengths unique to a female entrepreneur. Both Skylar and I have lost our husbands. But having a partner isn't the only form of happiness in life. I have the company my husband left behind. And Skylar has John. Isn't that enough? Skylar plans to work within her limits while pursuing her dream of becoming a nail technician, a goal that seems attainable. She asked her parents about the support for studying about a nail technician. She will return the money for them after she gets a job as a nail technician. As a nail technician, you can work from home. That way, you'll also have more time to spend with John. Skylar, smiling at these words, no longer has the dark shadows of her past. Every time I see my daughter-in-law laughing with my grandson, I'm reminded anew that my decision was the right one.